The storm clouds gathered on the horizon like a bruise spreading across the sky, casting an eerie green glow over the vast Wyoming plains as Brianna Mills urged her exhausted horse forward, one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. At 7 months pregnant and miles from the nearest town, she had never felt more alone or more determined to reach safety before the threatening weather unleashed its fury. Wyoming Territory. 1883, Brianna had been traveling for 3 days since leaving her sister's homestead in Cheyenne, determined to reach San Francisco before her child was born. Her husband Thomas had died 4 months earlier in a mining accident, leaving her alone and terrified of bringing a child into the world without support. Her sister had begged her to stay, but the memories there were too painful. A cousin in California had written promising work and a fresh start, and Brianna had seized the opportunity with the desperate hope of a drowning woman grasping at driftwood. The first fat droplets of rain splashed against her face as her horse, Penny, whinnied nervously. The wind had picked up considerably in the last hour, bending the prairie grasses flat and sending tumbleweeds bouncing across her path. Brianna squinted, desperately searching for shelter as the light began to fade. To her immense relief, she spotted a crude wooden structure in the distance, a lined shack, most likely used by cowboys during the cattle drives. It wasn't much, but it would provide protection from the increasingly threatening storm. "Just a little further, girl," she urged Penny, who seemed to understand the urgency and quickened her pace despite her fatigue. The lined shack was smaller than Brianna had hoped, a simple one-room wooden structure with a sloped roof and a small corral attached to one side. As she drew closer, she noticed smoke curling from the chimney. Someone was there. Under normal circumstances, Brianna might have hesitated to approach a stranger's temporary dwelling, especially as a woman alone. But with the sky darkening to an ominous pitch and the wind now howling like a wounded animal, she had little choice. She had barely dismounted, struggling with her awkward balance due to her pregnancy, when the door of the shack swung open. A tall man stepped out, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. He quickly assessed the situation, the pregnant woman, the frightened horse, and the threatening sky, and acted without hesitation. "Get inside, madam," he called over the wind, striding toward her. "Storm's coming in fast." "I'll take care of your horse." Brianna didn't argue. She grabbed her small satchel of belongings and made her way to the shack as quickly as her condition allowed. The interior was sparse but tidy. A small iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow cot in the corner, and various supplies hanging from hooks on the walls. The cowboy entered a few minutes later, removing his hat to reveal tousled dark hair and striking blue eyes in a sun-weathered face. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with a strong jaw and the lean, muscular build of a man who spent his life in the saddle. "Xavier Fleming," he introduced himself, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Your horse is secured in the corral with mine. Got her some feed, too." "Brianna Mills," she replied, self-consciously smoothing her travel-wrinkled dress. "Thank you, Mr. Fleming." "I apologize for the intrusion, but the storm—" "No need to apologize," he said, moving to stoke the fire in the stove. "Nobody should be out in what's brewing. You're welcome to wait it out here." A particularly violent gust of wind rattled the shack's walls, making Brianna jump. "Been watching that storm build all afternoon," Xavier said, his voice calm despite the worsening conditions outside. "Feared it might turn nasty. Looks like I was right." He glanced at her pregnant belly but made no comment about her traveling alone in her condition. "Are you headed somewhere nearby?" he asked instead, placing a dented kettle on the stove. "San Francisco," Brianna answered. I have family there. Xavier's eyebrows rose slightly. That's quite a journey, especially in your... He trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward her midsection. I'm aware it's not ideal, Brianna said, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. But sometimes life doesn't give us ideal options. Xavier nodded, accepting her explanation without pressing further. I've got some beans and bacon. Not fancy, but it's hot. You're welcome to share. Before Brianna could respond, a terrifying roar drowned out all other sounds. It was as if 1,000 freight trains were bearing down upon them. The walls of the shack began to shudder violently. Tornado, Xavier shouted, lunging toward Brianna. Get down. In the next instant, the world exploded around them. The roof of the line shack tore away as if made of paper, disappearing into the swirling darkness above. Rain and debris poured in as the walls began to buckle. Acting on instinct, Xavier wrapped his arms around Brianna, shielding her pregnant belly with his body. He looked around frantically, assessing their options as the shack continued to disintegrate around them. There's a gulch about 50 yards east, he shouted over the storm's fury. It's our best chance. With surprising gentleness despite the urgency, he wrapped his heavy oilskin coat around Brianna. Then, keeping his body between her and the worst of the flying debris, he guided her toward the door. The moment they stepped outside, the full force of the storm hit them like a physical blow. The air was filled with deadly projectiles, branches, fence posts, and unidentifiable objects torn from who knew where. Xavier dropped to his hands and knees, pulling Brianna down with him. Crawl, he yelled. Stay low. With one arm protectively curved around her middle, Brianna followed his lead, crawling painfully slowly across the muddy ground. Xavier stayed beside her, his broad shoulders taking the brunt of the smaller debris that rained down upon them. The roar was deafening, the air pressure so intense that Brianna felt her ears pop painfully. Through squinted eyes blurred with rain, she could make out a depression in the land ahead, the gulch Xavier had mentioned. It wasn't deep, but it offered the only protection in the flat landscape. As they neared it, a piece of lumber sliced through the air, striking Xavier on the shoulder. He grunted in pain but didn't slow. Almost there, he encouraged, his voice barely audible over the storm. They reached the edge of the gulch and Xavier helped her down the slippery embankment. The depression was about 8 feet deep, with a small stream of water already forming along its bottom from the torrential rain. Xavier positioned Brianna against the earthen wall, then pressed himself next to her, creating a human shield as the tornado passed directly overhead. For several terrifying minutes, they huddled together in the gulch, the world above them a chaotic maelstrom of wind, rain, and debris. Brianna found herself clinging to this stranger, drawing strength from his solid presence as nature's fury raged around them. She could feel Xavier's heart pounding against her shoulder, his breath warm against her hair as he kept her tucked securely against him. And then, gradually, the roar began to diminish. The pressure in the air eased. The deadly rain of debris slowed and eventually stopped. The tornado had passed, continuing its destructive path across the Wyoming plains but leaving them, miraculously, alive. They remained in the gulch for several long moments, neither speaking, just breathing in the sudden, strange quiet. Finally, Xavier shifted, wincing slightly as he moved his injured shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. Brianna nodded, her hands automatically moving to her belly. "Yes, I think so. The baby's moving." She looked up at him, noticing a trickle of blood on his temple. "You're hurt." Xavier touched his head, seeming surprised to find blood on his fingers. "It's nothing, just a scratch." He looked up at the sky, which was already beginning to clear in the tornado's wake. We should check on the horses and see what's left of the shack. He helped her carefully up the slippery side of the gulch. When they crested the top, Brianna gasped. The landscape had been transformed. Where the line shack had stood was now mostly rubble. A portion of one wall remained standing, along with the cast iron stove. But the roof was completely gone, scattered across the prairie in unrecognizable pieces. To her immense relief, the small corral had somehow remained relatively intact, and both horses were still there, huddled together and clearly frightened but apparently unharmed. "Thank God," she breathed, clutching Xavier's arm. He nodded, his expression grim as he surveyed the destruction. "Let's see what we can salvage." They picked through the remains of the line shack. Xavier's saddle bags had been flung several yards away but were miraculously intact. Brianna's small satchel was found half buried in mud, but still containing her few precious possessions: a photograph of her husband, a small amount of money, and a change of clothes. As darkness fell, Xavier managed to get the stove working again, setting it up in the partial shelter of the remaining wall. They sat beside it, wrapped in the blankets they'd recovered, and ate a simple meal of beans warmed on the stove. "What brought you out here alone?" Xavier asked, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. Brianna stared into the small fire. "My husband died," she said simply. "Thomas was a miner. There was an accident, a cave-in." She placed a protective hand over her belly. "He never knew about the baby." Xavier's expression softened with sympathy. "I'm sorry. I stayed with my sister in Cheyenne for a while, but—" Brianna sighed. "The memories were too much, and her husband never much cared for Thomas or me. My cousin in San Francisco wrote offering work in her dressmaking shop once the baby comes. It seemed like the best option. That's a long, hard journey for anyone, let alone—" Xavier glanced at her pregnant form. "A woman alone," Brianna finished with a slight edge to her voice. "I was going to say someone expecting," Xavier corrected gently. "But yes, that too. The trails west can be dangerous. I'm aware of the risks, Mr. Fleming, but staying posed its own dangers." She didn't elaborate, and Xavier didn't press. "What about you?" Brianna asked, changing the subject. "What brings a cowboy to this isolated spot?" Xavier poked at the fire with a stick. "I work for the Broken Spur Ranch about 15 miles south. I was checking line shacks and fences in this section of the range." A small smile tugged at his lips. "Supposed to report back tomorrow. Guess I'll have some interesting news." "I'm sorry about the shack," Brianna said, glancing at the destruction around them. Xavier shrugged his good shoulder. "Not your fault, and it can be rebuilt." He looked up at the now clear sky, stars emerging in the vast darkness. "We'll need to find better shelter until morning. There's another line shack about 4 miles west that should have escaped the tornado's path." Brianna nodded, though the thought of traveling again, even for such a short distance, made her weary bones ache. As if sensing her fatigue, Xavier added, "We'll rest here for a while first. No rush now that the storm's passed." They fell silent again, the crackling of the fire and the occasional snort from the horses the only sounds in the vast, open night. Despite the circumstances, Brianna felt strangely at peace. There was something solid and reassuring about Xavier Fleming's presence, a quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself. When her eyelids began to droop, Xavier insisted she take both blankets and rest while he kept watch. Too exhausted to argue, Brianna curled up as comfortably as her pregnant body would allow, the blankets wrapped tightly around her against the cooling night air. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Xavier's profile against the starlit sky, his vigilant silhouette promising safety in a world that had recently offered her very little of it. Morning came with a soft golden light that illuminated the tornado's path of destruction with stark clarity. Brianna awoke to find Xavier already up, tending to the horses and brewing coffee on the recovered stove. Her body ached from the ordeal and from sleeping on the hard ground, but she felt surprisingly rested. "Good morning," Xavier greeted her, offering a tin cup of steaming coffee. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," Brianna admitted, accepting the cup gratefully, "but alive thanks to you." Xavier shook his head. "You'd have found that gulch without me, perhaps, but I wouldn't have known to look for it," she countered. "Thank you, Mr. Fleming, truly." "Xavier," he corrected. "After sharing a tornado, I think we can dispense with formalities." A small smile touched Brianna's lips. "Xavier, then." They shared a simple breakfast of hardtack and jerky salvaged from Xavier's saddlebags, then prepared to leave for the other line shack. Xavier insisted on Brianna riding his horse, a sturdy black gelding named Midnight, while he led both animals on foot. The sky was clear now, with no hint of the previous day's violence except for the debris scattered across the landscape. "Have you been working for the Broken Spur long?" Brianna asked as they traveled, partly to distract herself from the discomfort of riding in her condition. 5 years, Xavier replied. "Started as just another hand, but I've worked up to foreman now." "That's impressive for someone so young," Brianna observed. A hint of a smile crossed Xavier's face. "I'm 31, not so young, and I've been around cattle since I could walk. My father ran a small spread in Texas before he died." "I'm sorry," Brianna said softly. Xavier nodded in acknowledgement but didn't dwell on it. "What about you? Were you always in Cheyenne?" "No, I grew up in St. Louis." "My father was a banker," Brianna explained. "He wanted me to marry a banker or lawyer, but I fell in love with Thomas instead. He was passing through on his way west, full of dreams about striking it rich in the gold fields." She smiled sadly at the memory. "Father disowned me when I married Thomas. We headed west, eventually settling in Cheyenne when Thomas found work in the mines. And now you're heading even further west," Xavier observed. "Yes. Though at the moment I'm not exactly making swift progress," Brianna said with a wry smile. The second line shack was smaller than the first but mercifully intact. It contained similar basic provisions: a stove, a narrow cot, a rough table, and a few supplies. Xavier immediately set about making it more comfortable, insisting that Brianna take the cot while he would sleep on the floor. "I should continue toward Laramie tomorrow," Brianna said as they ate a meal of beans and salt pork that evening. "I've delayed your return to the Broken Spur long enough." Xavier studied her for a moment. "It's not safe for you to travel alone," he said finally. "Not in your condition, and especially not after what just happened. Laramie's still a good 3 days' ride from here." "I managed before I met you," Brianna pointed out, though without much conviction. The truth was, the ordeal with the tornado had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. "And nearly got caught in a tornado," Xavier reminded her. "Look, the ranch can spare me for a few more days. I'll take you to Laramie myself, make sure you get a place on the westbound stage." Brianna wanted to protest, to assert her independence, but common sense prevailed. "That's very generous," she said instead. "Thank you." Xavier nodded as if the matter was settled. "We'll leave at first light, should make good progress if the weather holds." The next 3 days passed in a rhythm of travel and rest as they made their way toward Laramie. Xavier proved to be a thoughtful traveling companion, finding the smoothest paths for riding, making frequent stops when he sensed Brianna needed rest, and sharing stories of his life as a cowboy to pass the time. Brianna found herself increasingly drawn to this quiet, capable man. There was a gentleness to him that belied his rugged exterior, a consideration that manifested in countless small ways: the way he helped her on and off the horse without making her feel helpless, how he always made sure she ate before he did, the respect with which he treated her opinions and decisions. On their third day of travel, they made camp in a small grove of cottonwoods beside a clear running creek. As Brianna washed her face in the cool water, she caught Xavier watching her, a soft expression in his eyes that he quickly masked when he realized she'd noticed. That evening, as they sat beside the campfire, Brianna found herself opening up about Thomas in a way she hadn't with anyone else. "He was a dreamer," she said, staring into the flames. "Always certain the next claim would be the one to make us rich. I loved that about him at first, his optimism, his certainty that something better was just around the corner. But it wore thin after a while," Xavier guessed. Brianna nodded slowly. "I started to crave stability, especially once I suspected I might be with child. We argued about it the morning before the accident," her voice caught. "I told him I was tired of chasing fantasies, that we needed to think about the future, about building something real." She wiped away a tear. "Those were the last words I ever said to him. Not 'I love you,' but criticism of his dreams." Xavier reached across the space between them, his hand covering hers briefly. "He knew you loved him," he said with quiet certainty, "and he would want you to be safe now, to do what's best for your child." Brianna looked up, meeting his gaze across the flickering firelight. "Yes," she whispered, "I believe he would." The moment stretched between them, filled with something unspoken but increasingly tangible. Finally, Xavier cleared his throat and stood up. "We should get some rest. We'll reach Laramie by midday tomorrow if we make an early start." Brianna nodded, both relieved and disappointed at the broken connection. As she settled into her bedroll, she found herself contemplating the unexpected turn her journey had taken. 3 days ago, Xavier Fleming had been a stranger. Now, the thought of continuing her journey without him left an emptiness she wasn't prepared to examine too closely. Laramie appeared on the horizon the next day, a sprawling collection of buildings that represented civilization after their days on the trail. As they rode into town, Brianna felt a curious reluctance slowing her movements, a desire to prolong these final moments with Xavier. The stagecoach office confirmed what Xavier had already suspected: the next stage west wouldn't depart for 2 days. He promptly secured Brianna a room at the Laramie Hotel, a modest but respectable establishment on the main street. "You don't need to wait with me," Brianna said as they stood awkwardly in the hotel lobby. "I'm sure your employer is expecting you back." "They can wait one more day," Xavier replied. "I'd like to make sure you're settled and on that stage before I head back." Relief flooded through Brianna, though she tried not to show it too plainly. "Thank you. That's very kind." That evening, Xavier took her to dinner at the hotel's small dining room. Cleaned up from the trail, his dark hair still damp from a bath, he cut a striking figure in his best shirt and vest. Brianna had done what she could with her limited wardrobe, washing her face and arranging her hair more carefully than she had in days. As they shared a meal far more elaborate than their trail fare, Brianna found herself studying Xavier's face, memorizing his features. The sharp angle of his jaw, the small scar near his right eyebrow, the way the corners of his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled. "Tell me about San Francisco," he said as they lingered over coffee. "What will you do there?" "My cousin has a dressmaking shop," Brianna explained. "I'm quite skilled with a needle. She's offered me work and a place to stay until I can establish myself. And after the baby comes, she has a nurse who will help care for the child while I work," Brianna said. "It's not ideal, but it's the best option I have." Xavier nodded thoughtfully. "You're a brave woman, Brianna Mills," she smiled sadly. Not brave, just doing what needs to be done. That is bravery, Xavier insisted, facing what needs facing even when it's hard. He hesitated, then added, I admire that about you. A warm flush crept up Brianna's neck at the compliment. You make it sound grander than it is. I see it as it is, Xavier said simply. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, Brianna allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where she didn't board that stagecoach, where she built a new life here instead, with this man who had saved her life and was quickly claiming a place in her heart. But reality intruded in the form of a sharp kick from the baby, a pointed reminder of her responsibilities and the practical considerations that had to take precedence over romantic notions. The next day, Xavier showed her around Laramie, pointing out the better shops and introducing her to a few people he knew. Everyone they met treated her with respect, clearly taking their cue from the obvious esteem in which Xavier held her. By the time evening fell again, Brianna's heart was in turmoil. In just a few days, Xavier Fleming had become important to her in ways she couldn't fully articulate, even to herself. The thought of saying goodbye the next morning filled her with a heaviness that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. After another dinner at the hotel, Xavier walked her to her room. At the door, he hesitated, clearly wrestling with something he wanted to say. Brianna, he finally began, his voice unusually uncertain. I know we've only known each other a short time, and I have no right to ask this, but... He took a deep breath. Don't go to San Francisco. Brianna stared at him, her heart suddenly pounding. What? Stay in Wyoming, Xavier continued, the words coming faster now. Stay at the Broken Spur with me. The owner's wife has been wanting help with household management, and there's a comfortable cottage on the property where you could live. After the baby comes, if you still want to move on, I'll understand. But at least you wouldn't be alone when your time comes. Brianna's mind raced. Xavier, This is so unexpected. I know, he acknowledged, and I'm not asking for any promises, His blue eyes were intense with sincerity. I can't bear the thought of you facing all this alone when you don't have to. Why would you do this? Brianna whispered. You barely know me. Xavier's expression softened. I know enough. I know you're brave and strong and determined. I know you've faced loss but haven't let it break you. And I know that from the moment I saw you at that line shack, something changed for me. Tears welled in Brianna's eyes. This is madness, she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. Maybe, Xavier agreed with a small smile, but sometimes madness makes more sense than what passes for reason. He reached out, gently taking her hand. Just think about it. The stage doesn't leave until tomorrow afternoon. With that, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles, then turned and walked away, leaving Brianna staring after him with her heart in her throat and her future suddenly, unexpectedly, wide open with new possibilities. Sleep eluded Brianna that night as she weighed Xavier's unexpected offer against her original plan. San Francisco represented security of a sort of defined path forward with her cousin's support and the promise of honest work. But it was also unknown territory, thousands of miles from everything familiar. And then there was Xavier himself. In less than a week, this quiet, steady cowboy had come to mean something to her that she couldn't dismiss. There was a connection between them that defied the brevity of their acquaintance. When she thought of boarding that stage and never seeing him again, her chest ached with a grief that seemed disproportionate yet undeniable. By morning, she had made her decision. Xavier was waiting in the hotel lobby when she came downstairs, his hat in his hands and anxiety clear in the set of his shoulders. When he saw her, he straightened, studying her face for any hint of her thoughts. I've been thinking about your offer, Brianna said without preamble. And Xavier's voice was carefully neutral, but hope flickered in his eyes. "It's impractical and probably foolish," Brianna began, watching his expression fall slightly. "But," she continued, a small smile forming, "I find I'm not as committed to practicality as I once thought. I'd like to accept if the offer still stands." The smile that transformed Xavier's face was like sunrise breaking over the plains. "It stands," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "It definitely stands." Relief and something akin to joy washed through Brianna. "Then I won't be taking that stage today." Xavier reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "You won't regret this, Brianna, I promise you that." "I'll hold you to that promise, Xavier Fleming," she replied, surprising herself with the lightness in her voice, a lightness she hadn't felt since before Thomas died. They left Laramie that afternoon, heading south toward the Broken Spur Ranch. Xavier had sent a telegram to his employer explaining the situation, and had received a prompt reply welcoming Brianna to the ranch and confirming the offer of employment and housing. The journey to the Broken Spur took 2 days, during which Brianna and Xavier continued to learn more about each other. Xavier spoke of his dreams of someday having his own spread, while Brianna shared stories of her childhood in St. Louis and her early days with Thomas. There was a growing ease between them, a comfortable rapport that belied the newness of their relationship. The Broken Spur Ranch was larger than Brianna had imagined, a substantial operation with a main house, bunkhouse, barn, corrals, and various outbuildings spread across a well-maintained compound. Several smaller cottages dotted the perimeter, one of which, Xavier explained, would be Brianna's new home. Margaret Thornton, the ranch owner's wife, was a robust woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense manner that Brianna found reassuring rather than intimidating. She welcomed Brianna warmly, expressing delight at having another woman on the property. "Heaven knows we could use a feminine touch around here," Margaret declared as she showed Brianna the cottage that would be hers. "And Xavier tells me you're handy with a needle, which is a blessing since I've never had the patience for fine sewing." The cottage was simple but charming, 2 rooms with a small attached kitchen, already furnished with the basics and scrupulously clean. A narrow bed stood against one wall, a rocking chair near the small fireplace, and a table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the main room. "It's not fancy," Margaret apologized, "but it's solid and warm, and there's plenty of room for a cradle when the little one arrives." "It's perfect," Brianna assured her, already envisioning how she might make the space her own. "Xavier said you're due in about 2 months, Margaret inquired. "Yes, early June, the doctor in Cheyenne thought," Margaret nodded approvingly. "Good timing. Dr. Jenkins comes through here regular, about every 3 weeks. He should be by next week, actually. You can get acquainted, and he'll be here when your time comes." The practicality of the arrangements eased one of Brianna's primary concerns about staying in Wyoming. Having medical care available for the birth had been a major factor in her decision to head for San Francisco. Later that evening, after Margaret had gone back to the main house, Xavier stopped by the cottage, bringing a small crate of provisions from the ranch's stores. "Just some basics to get you started," he explained, setting it on the table. "Mrs. Thornton said to tell you she'll come by tomorrow to go over your duties." "Everyone has been very kind," Brianna said, feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the day's events. "Especially you." Xavier shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. "It's nothing. It's everything," Brianna corrected softly. "You've changed the course of my life, Xavier. I hope it's for the better, but either way, I won't forget that." Xavier stepped closer, his expression serious. "I meant what I said in Laramie. You're under no obligation here. If at any point you want to continue to San Francisco, I'll personally see that you get there safely." The sincerity in his voice touched Brianna deeply. "Thank you," she said. "But for now, at least, I'd like to see where this path leads." A slow smile spread across Xavier's face. "I'd like that too," he said simply. The weeks that followed settled into a routine that Brianna found unexpectedly satisfying. Her duties at the ranch were varied but not overly taxing, especially as her pregnancy advanced. She helped Margaret with the household accounts, mended the Cowboy's clothing, and assisted with meal planning and preparation for the ranch hands. Xavier's position as foreman kept him busy, often riding out to distant parts of the ranch's extensive holdings, but he made a point of checking on Brianna daily when he was on the property. Their relationship developed gradually, built on small moments of connection, shared meals, evening walks when the weather was fine, quiet conversations on her cottage porch as the sun set over the Wyoming plains. Dr. Jenkins, the traveling physician Margaret had mentioned, confirmed that Brianna's pregnancy was progressing normally and that the baby appeared to be in the proper position. His kind manner and obvious competence further reassured her that she had made the right decision in staying. As May turned to June, Brianna's body prepared for the impending birth. Her back ached constantly, and the baby seemed to be constantly moving, as if eager to enter the world. Xavier became increasingly attentive, ensuring that someone was always nearby in case Brianna needed assistance. One warm evening, as they sat on the porch of her cottage watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Xavier finally addressed the unspoken question between them. "Brianna," he began, his voice gentle but serious, "I need to know what you're thinking about the future, about us." Brianna had been expecting this conversation but still felt a flutter of nervousness. "What are you asking exactly?" Xavier turned to face her more directly, his blue eyes earnest in the fading light. "I'm asking if you see a place for me in your life and your child's life. Not just as a friend or protector, but as something more." The directness of the question both startled and pleased her. "I've come to care for you deeply, Xavier," she admitted. "More than I thought possible after Thomas, but this child complicates things." "How so?" "This is Thomas's child," Brianna explained. "I don't want to dishonor his memory or confuse the baby about who their father was." Xavier considered this, then nodded slowly. "I understand that, and I would never try to replace Thomas in your child's memory. But children can have room in their hearts for many people who love them." He reached out, taking her hand. "Just as I believe you can have room in your heart to love again without diminishing what you felt for Thomas." Tears welled in Brianna's eyes at the simple wisdom of his words. "When did you become so wise about matters of the heart?" she asked, attempting to lighten the moment. Xavier smiled. "I'm not wise. I just know what I feel. And what I feel for you is real, Brianna. Real enough to build a life on if you're willing." Before Brianna could respond, a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, causing her to gasp and clutch her stomach. Xavier was immediately alert. "What is it? What's wrong?" "I think." Brianna breathed through the pain, which was already subsiding. "I think that might have been a contraction." Xavier's eyes widened with alarm and excitement. "The baby's coming, maybe," Brianna said cautiously. "It could be false labor. We should wait and see if..." Another contraction cut off her words, this one stronger than the first. Xavier didn't hesitate. "I'm getting Margaret and sending for the doctor," he said, already on his feet. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of pain, fear, and determination for Brianna. Dr. Jenkins arrived just as her labor intensified, bringing a calm efficiency to the cottage that had become a birthing chamber. Margaret proved to be an experienced birth attendant, having assisted with numerous deliveries on the ranch and in the surrounding area. Xavier, to Brianna's surprise, refused to be banished to the bunkhouse with the other men. Instead, he paced outside the cottage, occasionally checking in to see if there was anything he could do, his concern evident in every line of his face. As dawn broke over the Wyoming plains, Brianna's daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that immediately endeared her to everyone present. Dr. Jenkins cleaned and examined the infant, pronouncing her perfectly healthy before placing her in Brianna's exhausted arms. "She's beautiful," Brianna whispered, tears streaming down her face as she counted tiny fingers and toes. "Perfect." "She is indeed," Margaret agreed, her usual brisk manner softened by the moment. "Xavier's wearing a trench outside. Shall I send him in?" Brianna nodded, suddenly eager to share this moment with the man who had become so important to her life. When Xavier entered, his expression of wonder and reverence at the sight of mother and child brought fresh tears to Brianna's eyes. "Come meet her," she invited softly. Xavier approached cautiously, as if afraid he might somehow harm the delicate scene before him. He knelt beside the bed, gazing in awe at the tiny face peering out from the swaddling blanket. "She looks like you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Poor child," Brianna joked weakly, exhaustion evident in her voice. Xavier shook his head. "Lucky child," he corrected. "To have such a mother." He reached out tentatively, touching one finger to the baby's tiny hand. The infant reflexively grasped his finger, and the look of amazement that crossed Xavier's face touched Brianna's heart deeply. "What will you call her?" he asked, still entranced by the newborn. Brianna had been considering names throughout her pregnancy but had yet to settle on one. Now, looking at her daughter and the man beside her, she knew. "Hope," she said decisively. "Her name is Hope Mills." Xavier looked up, understanding the significance immediately. "It's perfect." In that moment, with her newborn daughter in her arms and Xavier Fleming looking at them both with such tenderness, Brianna felt a certainty settle in her heart. The path forward was clear now, illuminated by new beginnings and unexpected love. "About what you asked earlier," she said softly, before Hope decided to make her appearance. Xavier's expression grew serious, attentive. "Yes, I do see a place for you in our lives," Brianna continued, "if you're still offering." The smile that transformed Xavier's face was answer enough, but he put it into words anyway. "I'm offering my heart, Brianna Mills, for as long as you and Hope want it." "That might be a very long time," Brianna warned, a smile playing at her lips despite her exhaustion. "I'm counting on it," Xavier replied, leaning forward to press a gentle kiss to her forehead. The months that followed brought adjustments and discoveries as Brianna settled into motherhood and continued to deepen her relationship with Xavier. Hope thrived under the loving attention of her mother and the man who increasingly filled the role of father in her life. By the time Hope was 6 months old, Brianna and Xavier had established a comfortable routine. Xavier had moved from the bunkhouse to a room in the main house to be closer to them while still maintaining propriety. He spent most evenings at Brianna's cottage, often rocking Hope to sleep, while Brianna prepared a simple dinner for them to share. It was during one such evening, with Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle and a winter storm raging outside, that Xavier finally put into words what had been growing between them. "Marry me, Brianna," he said simply, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Be my wife. Let me be Hope's father in every way that matters." Though she had been anticipating this moment, Brianna still felt a flutter of emotion at the formal proposal. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Taking on another man's child is a big responsibility." Xavier's expression was solemn yet tender. "Hope stopped being another man's child to me the moment I held her. She's yours, which makes her precious to me." He squeezed Brianna's hand gently. "I love you both. I want to build a life with you, a family. That's what I'm certain of." Tears of joy welled in Brianna's eyes. "Then yes, Xavier Fleming, I'll marry you." Their wedding took place the following spring, a simple ceremony in the Laramie church with the Thorntons and several of the Broken Spur hands in attendance. Hope, now nearly a year old and taking her first tentative steps, served as an unconventional flower girl, carried down the aisle by Margaret Thornton. As Brianna spoke her vows to Xavier, she felt Thomas's presence briefly not as a shadow over her happiness, but as a benevolent witness to her new beginning. She would always honor his memory and ensure that Hope knew about her birth father, but her heart now belonged fully to Xavier. The years that followed brought changes and growth. Xavier eventually realized his dream of owning his own ranch, purchasing a modest spread near the Broken Spur with savings from his years as foreman and a loan from James Thornton, who had become a mentor and friend. Hope grew into a spirited, intelligent child with her mother's determination and her adoptive father's quiet strength. She was joined 2 years after Brianna and Xavier's wedding by a brother, Thomas Xavier Fleming, named in honor of both the father Hope had never known and the man who had stepped so lovingly into that role. 2 years after Thomas came another daughter, Margaret Rose, called Maggie by everyone at the ranch. The Fleming family flourished on their growing ranch, building a life marked by hard work, deep love, and the special resilience that comes from knowing how quickly life can change for worse, but sometimes, miraculously, for better. On the 5th anniversary of the tornado that had brought them together, Xavier and Brianna stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set over the Wyoming plains. "Do you ever think about how different life might have been if you'd made it to that stage in Laramie?" Xavier asked, his arm around Brianna's waist. Brianna leaned into him, contemplating the question. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with regret, never with regret." Xavier pressed a kiss to her temple. "That tornado was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me," he said, only half joking, terrifying as it was at the time. "It wasn't luck," Brianna said softly. "It was fate." She turned in his arms, looking up at the face she had come to know as well as her own. "When I left Cheyenne, I thought I was heading toward a new beginning. I just didn't realize that beginning would be you." Xavier's blue eyes, still as bright and clear as they had been that first day at the line shack, crinkled with his smile. "Well, Mrs. Fleming," he said, "I'd say we've made quite a beginning." He nodded toward their children, Hope now 7, Thomas 5, and little Maggie 3, playing some elaborate game involving sticks and stones and much laughter. And it just keeps getting better. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Brianna reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From grief and uncertainty to this moment of profound contentment, from a frightening encounter with nature's fury to the sustaining warmth of true partnership. The path had not been straight or easy, but it had led exactly where she needed to go. "I love you, Xavier Fleming," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of their shared history and the promise of their future. "And I love you," Xavier replied, pulling her closer as the Wyoming twilight deepened around them. "Forever and always." In the distance, a spring storm gathered on the horizon, but this time there was no fear in Brianna's heart, only gratitude for the unexpected twists of fate that had brought her home. 10 years later, the Fleming Ranch had grown into one of the more prosperous operations in the region. What had started as a modest spread had expanded to include prime grazing land, a sturdy barn, comfortable corrals, and a main house that, while not grand, offered ample room for their family of 5. Hope, now 17, had grown into a poised young woman with her mother's auburn hair and her birth father's thoughtful nature. Thomas, at 15, was showing every sign of following in Xavier's footsteps, already spending most of his free time working with the horses and cattle. 12-year-old Maggie was the family scholar, devouring any book she could get her hands on and dreaming of attending college someday. On a warm summer evening, the family gathered on the porch after dinner, a ritual they had maintained throughout the years. Xavier and Brianna sat side by side in rocking chairs, while the children occupied the porch steps. "Tell us the tornado story again, Pa," Maggie requested, her eyes bright with anticipation despite having heard the tale countless times. Xavier chuckled, exchanging an amused glance with Brianna. "Again, don't you ever tire of that old yarn?" "Never," Hope declared firmly. "It's our family's beginning." "That it is," Xavier agreed, settling back in his chair. "Well, it was June of '83 and I was checking line shacks for the broken spur." As Xavier recounted the now familiar story, embellished slightly for dramatic effect as it had been over the years, Brianna watched her family's faces in the golden evening light. Hope listened with the dreamy expression of a young woman beginning to think about her own future romance. Thomas pretended casual interest, but was clearly captivated by the adventure elements of the story. Maggie hung on every word, occasionally mouthing certain phrases along with her father. The story had become part of their family mythology, the tornado that had destroyed a line shack but created a family. Over the years, Brianna had occasionally wondered about the role of chance in their lives. What if she had left Cheyenne a day earlier or later? What if Xavier hadn't been at that particular line shack? What if the tornado had veered just slightly in another direction? But such questions were ultimately meaningless. What mattered was what had happened, not what might have been. And what had happened was that 2 people, each damaged in their own way, had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful together. "And then," Xavier continued, reaching the climax of the story, "I wrapped your mother in my coat and we crawled to the Gulch just as the tornado passed directly overhead." "Were you scared, Ma?" Thomas asked, as he always did at this point in the story. "Terrified," Brianna answered honestly. "But your father made me feel safe, even in the middle of all that danger." "That's romance," Hope sighed appreciatively. "That's survival," Thomas corrected with the practical outlook of a teenage boy. "It's both," Brianna said, reaching over to take Xavier's hand. "The best love stories always are." As twilight deepened into night, the conversation turned to more immediate matters: plans for the next day's work, an upcoming trip to Laramie for supplies, Hope's desire to attend the harvest dance in town the following month. Normal, everyday concerns of a family firmly rooted in the present while honoring the extraordinary past that had brought them together. Later, after the children had gone to bed, Brianna and Xavier remained on the porch, enjoying the peaceful Wyoming night. The years had added silver threads to Xavier's dark hair and fine lines around Brianna's eyes, but the connection between them had only deepened with time. 17 years, Xavier mused, his thumb tracing circles on the back of Brianna's hand. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you rode up to that line shack." "And sometimes it feels like another lifetime," Brianna replied. "So much has happened since then." "Any regrets?" Xavier asked, the question a ritual between them, asked and answered many times over the years. Brianna shook her head, her response as certain now as it had always been. "Not one. Every step, every decision led me here to this life with you and our children. How could I regret that?" Xavier raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "I thank God for that tornado every day," he said softly, "for bringing you to me when I didn't even know I was waiting. And I thank God for the cowboy who knew enough to head for the Gulch," Brianna returned with a smile. "My hero then and now." They fell silent, content in each other's company as they had been for nearly 2 decades. Above them, stars filled the vast Wyoming sky, bearing witness to a love that had begun in chaos but had flourished in the peace that followed. A love built day by day, through joy and sorrow, through the raising of children and the building of a ranch, through all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that comprised a life shared. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound echoing across the open range. Xavier squeezed Brianna's hand gently, and she squeezed back, the simple gesture containing all the words they didn't need to say. They had found each other against impossible odds, and every day since had been a gift neither took for granted. As the night deepened around them, Brianna and Xavier remained on their porch, two souls who had weathered life's tornadoes together and emerged stronger for it. Their love a shelter more enduring than any roof, their family the most precious legacy of that stormy day so long ago when fate had blown them into each other's lives.